So this is the review session for Exam 3. It is not a cumulative exam, so it'll strictly be focused on what we've covered since Exam 2. Let me be honest with you as far as the readings go. I went back and reread the textbook chapters and material that I'd assigned you in preparation for the exam. However, I did not pull material directly from the textbook for the exam. Where I pulled material directly from was from our classroom presentations. So I know I'm shooting myself a little bit in the foot because you may be tempted to say, well, I'm just not going to go back and reread the book to get ready for the exam. But I think there's value in you doing that, because I think in some cases, having reread the textbook, you'll then be able to better recall the class discussions and some of the key principles that I'm going to ask you to get. Also remember that there are a lot of things in the textbook that we didn't cover on in class, so you don't need to worry about them. And specifically, that's anything having to do with the offshore industry. If you take the offshore out and things about all the super tankers, that's going to cut down some of the material that you can skim through. It took me very little time, frankly, to go back and review that material because that textbook is a very easy read. Likewise, I went back and reviewed the two papers that I asked you to read for the renewables section, and they're excellent background information, but again, I didn't pull anything directly from them for the exam. So what we did talk about after Exam 2 in the class was we started off by talking about the financial applications of oil wells. The first day we looked at the AFEs. I wish I could have left those with you, but I wasn't comfortable doing that. But if you remember, one of the AFEs separated things into dry hole cost or drilling cost. In other words, how much do we have to spend just to confirm the presence or absence of minerals in economic quantities down on the well, and we'll call that the dry hole cost. And the second would be the completed cost of a well, and that's once we've drilled it and we confirm the presence of economic levels materials, how much is it going to cost us to get the well ready to actually begin producing. As far as the dry hole costs go, if you remember, by far the dominant cost was actually the rental, the drilling rig, and the crew. There are a lot of expensive other items. Fuel to run the drilling rig is expensive. Funding the directional drillers is expensive. Sometimes some of the materials like the pipe and the casing and the concreting are expensive, but none of them rise to the level, at least in the wells that we looked at, rise to the level of renting and operating the drilling rig itself. Likewise, on the completion side, there were also a lot of expensive things that you had to worry about. You had to worry about the casing was surprisingly expensive. The production tubing is surprisingly expensive to put in to that. The surface equipment actually isn't as expensive as I thought it might be in terms of the separators and the tank batteries and the like. But on horizontal wells, all of that stuff again is basically dwarfed by the fracking cost in terms of bringing the water in, hiring the fracking crews, and that sort of stuff. So those are the main cost leaders that I want you to understand. What are the really big expenses and what kind of the moderately big expenses? And you know that we looked at wells that cost everywhere from $2 million to $13 million, and those basic ratios or principles were the same. Then we looked at the financial aspects of oil wells. I've appended to D2L not only the worksheet that we worked through in class, but I've appended my answers to the questions I had you work through in class. That's probably going to be useful for you to go back and just remember what we did with that. The thing that we walked away with is, at least for the things that we modeled, what made a big difference in the profitability was not so much the expenses. Drilling, yes. I mean, if the drilling costs go way up, they can make a difference, but even that was not as powerful as I thought. The price of oil wasn't as powerful. The operating expenses were relatively small. The amount of royalty you had to give was smaller. It was largely about how much oil you're really going to be able to produce. And so the initial flow rate and the decline rate were items that significantly affected the profitability of the well. I think it's worth you spending some time to go through that. You can go through my cheat sheet or my answer sheet, if you will, and just compare the numbers as we go from the base case and what do we change, to refresh yourself on the sensitivities that we observed. Then we picked up with the midstream topic. And so what I'm going to do is go through the slides and just kind of emphasize what I want you to be focused on. Very important that you keep in mind that we want to understand the interrelationship between the E&P industry or the upstream industry and the midstream, and how those are interrelated. Also, something I want you to understand is how within the United States, pipelines are the way the product gets moved. In fact, with gas, it's virtually everything in gas that gets moved by pipeline. But even in the other liquids, you can see that the ratio is very high in terms of what's moved in the pipelines. I was surprised, and it was fun to learn about how much actually moves by water, but a lot of that are refined products as opposed to crude. Rail has grown significantly. You're going to want to go through your notes and make sure that you refresh yourself on why rail has grown so significantly. You're going to want to look at the economic case for rail off of this slide. But then sadly, we're constantly reminded that even though rail's made a lot of improvements, right now its safety record does not equal that of the pipeline industry. This chart should remind you both where a lot of the collection is being done. So here's the Marcellus. This is the Haynesville Shale, then all across Texas and in the Gulf Coast, and some up in the central area, and then how it has to be moved to population centers. This is an even stronger graphic that you should take some time being familiar with. Where does the gas tend to originate, and where does it tend to go? And the width of the line, if you will, is an indicator of the quantity of the flow. Within the pipeline infrastructure, I'm not going to ask any specific questions on how many there are, but certainly taking a look at the growth in the pipelines, infrastructure, and which types of pipelines tend to be growing faster than others are things that I do expect you to remember. Some of the pipeline basics, these are important, and I would know this slide and be familiar with it. The particular question I ask you off of this is kind of an application question to see whether you really understood it. Then if you remember, we talked about there's a fundamental difference between the oil and gas markets simply because whereas oil demand and consumption tends to be a little bit more stable on an annual basis, in fact, the gas varies quite a bit. You have obviously a winter peak, and then you have a smaller summer peak, and then in the spring and the fall, your gas usage is a lot smaller. And so that creates real challenges in the storage arena. So you're going to want to be familiar with some of the aspects of how we store gas. We talked about the growth of master limited partnerships and why they're particularly useful in the midstream industry. Talked about a couple of companies. I don't ask you any specific information about those companies. And then we talked about the LNG market. Who makes sense to be an exporter of LNG? Who makes sense to be an importer of LNG? We had 3 presentations on this from the students, so you should be very familiar with this. We know that recently the price for LNG has collapsed worldwide, so being familiar with why it's collapsed, being familiar with what is the very expensive pacers in LNG, and how they try to put things on long-term contracts, although here we see the price that they're charging for the spot market and the challenges that we see with that. Open season, remember, is again where companies go out and try to sign people up for long-term pipeline contracts, much as companies try to sign other companies up for long-term LNG contracts. I'm going to stop the tape and switch slides. The next major topic was the downstream industry. Remember this, obviously we're talking about refineries. We talked about the crack spread and what has been happening to the crack spread. And some of that has to do with the things we talked about with exporting oil, that because they're able to increasingly pick up the West Texas Intermediate at significant discounts to what its quote-unquote true value is, refineries haven't been always passing that along to the customer being you and me buying gas. This is just a good orientation slide. You can see that the refining capacity is greater than the production capacity of liquids on a daily basis. So we have surplus refining capacity in the United States. The majority of it's oriented along the Gulf Coast. The company that we all know, Valero, is the biggest refiner by capacity in the United States, and then comes ExxonMobil, Marathon, Phillips, Motiva. Notice that it's these four that are the bigs, and people fall off pretty quickly after that. Again, don't need to remember this, just that some of these locations are very big. I don't have any specific questions on the genealogy of the major refiners, so don't worry about memorizing something like that. These charts tend to be real important, and this is an excellent chart because this familiarizes you with some of the basic processes that happen in a refinery and then what they yield. And this is a very accurate chart, if you will. It matches up very well with the more detailed descriptions of the refining processes in the textbook. And I think you may do yourself very well to go back and reread the textbook on the refining processes. I'm not going to test you on the different types, but I do expect you to know what cracking involves. We looked at a couple of, well, I'll catch up with that. And then we talked about, and this is a really important point, that all refineries don't have the same capacity. So they're tweaked based on the equipment that they have to handle different types of crude input and to produce different types of product slates. Likewise, down here, not all crude is created equally. So you can see the different types tend to vary the different products that can come out. And so this is something that I would be familiar with, very familiar with. On the refining processes, remember, it all starts with the distillation. Be familiar with this basic process and how the fractional distiller works. And again, we have a lot of good links for you to rewatch some of these videos. This is not as accurate in terms of the processes and the outputs as this chart is. So when it comes to refreshing yourself of what's going on, then I would rely more on that, not so much on this cartoon. Remember, the basic process I wanted you to be familiar with, though, were distillation. When I say familiar, I mean to kind of understand cracking, not all the subtypes of cracking, but in general what cracking is and how cracking works. Again, these links are very good for you to review. I'll be honest with you, I don't talk about, there are no questions on these. I primarily want you to focus on the major refining processes. We talked about turnaround, and this is a good chart to get a sense of how a refinery is used and how heavily refineries are used, and that's some important information. We talked a little bit about, we looked at the numbers of Valero and just what they look like in terms of as the largest U.S. refiner by capacity, and just see how large their revenues are and then how little their income is. And of course, that's because they buy crude and then they sell the refined products, so it costs a lot for them to get what they need. Okay, and then we want to talk about downstream, just understand how it interacts with midstream. Another topic we discussed is the regulatory process, and this really is kind of a big deal. Know where the states have primary regulatory oversight and where the federal government regulates. So we played this game, and this is certainly something I think if you remember all this, you're going to be in good stead. Federal lands, remember the BLM is primary. I do not ask which regulatory agency, what the title of each regulatory agency is in each state, nor do I ask about the title of the land office. We talked about some examples of how states differ and some issues that Texas is dealing with currently. Then we looked at where does the federal government tend to get involved. And as we see, these are all tied to relatively significant national acts and how this is where the federal government has a lot to say. In particular, there are two issues right now, or three issues that are very hot. Waters of the U.S. that we talked about, and the main thing that I want you to get out of that is just that this would, if the definition that the federal government's proposed, it would really expand areas that require permitting, and that would have a big deal with the oil and gas industry. The Safe Drinking Water Act, big deal here is the EPA in 2015 released a study on fracking. And it's very important to me that you understand the possible contamination routes for fracking, how the oil industry handles that. But also, and I've got down in the bottom of the slides that were available, I had some specific text from the EPA study, and I want you to know what the EPA had to say. I don't consider the EPA to be an unbiased actor on this issue necessarily. So the fact that they are actually, basically they said they didn't find widespread hazards to do with fracking to be pretty significant. Clean Air Act, again, Hannah and others gave good presentations about VOCs and methane gas, and this is something that we just need to be focused on as an industry, is that the EPA is trying to reduce them a bunch. Wildlife, there are no questions here. And there could be a really good application question come out of this discussion, but I'll be honest with you, I don't have any. And then this is a good summary slide to have you equipped on that aspect. And then our last major topic is on the renewables. And so this, in fact, is a pretty good explanation of what I want you to get. We had a really good philosophical discussion here, and I think everybody's familiar with that. These are some key issues that I'm not going to test you on directly, but they're important concepts for you to understand. I'm not sure that I emphasized enough the other operational issues, and I'm going to talk about that when it comes up. But these are all things to be familiar with. I don't know that there's not a specific test question on them, but I think understanding them will help you. This is important to understand where energy is currently being used, or what the sources of energy are and how it's being used. So make sure that you're very familiar with this, particularly as it would have pertained to renewables. Then we talked about the concept. I tried to use this discussion of the Camry versus the Tesla to highlight this very important concept of power density. And the reality is batteries do not provide pound for pound nearly the energy currently as do refined fossil fuels. And so because of that, transportation is going to be a hard market for them to break into in terms of airline travel or air travel, or the 18-wheelers going down the road. Anything where you cannot afford to carry around just a lot of battery weight to be electric is going to be a hard market, and that's why I think transportation is going to be the last market that renewables are going to be able to penetrate until the batteries significantly improve and come closer to fossil fuels and power density. Then we talked about electricity, and this is important to understand. Baseload, intermediate, and peaking, the EIA has a really good link here, and so I want you to understand when electricity is used, and then I want you to think about when would solar be a good use to fit into the standard types of energy usage. The grid, we don't really talk about the fact that Texas is its own island, but it's important for me that you remember that because it's pretty significant as we go forward. Don't ask you about the fuel sources in particular for Texas, but just keep in mind, remember last year, basically Texas got about 11%, or this is 2013, Texas got about 11% of its electricity from wind. And what's interesting, again, I'm kind of preaching here, is actually natural gas by far eclipses coal, and that's not common across the United States. But Texas is the harbinger of the future in that sense. So we talked about where solar works. We talked about concentrated solar power. This is something where you're going to want to understand the advantages and disadvantages of concentrated solar power versus PV, particularly on the utility scale. And then these two links, I showed this one in class. I didn't have time to show this one. Talks about net metering, which is the concept of when consumers get to sell back from their primarily today solar, photovoltaic solar cells to the industry or into the utility back into the grid. And so you're going to want to read those and make sure you understand the concept of net metering. Investment tax credits, no particular questions on that other than, as you can imagine, you can see if they lose them, they think it's going to slow things down. And then wind potential, this is a great story of why we see so much wind in Texas, although you can see in here we're not great where we're building today. No test question on it, but I hope everybody remembers the fact that Texas is by far the state with the greatest amount of wind installed. And you see that in the projects. These are good links to click on just to kind of remind yourself. Then we talked about how to compare oil exploration and development versus wind. Then we talked about the challenges of routing. Try to conclude this with a couple of important observations. In terms of cost, the article that I had you read pointed out that because the fuel is free for a renewable, the majority of the cost is in the construction. And here are the elements that go into that cost. The single largest expense is the turbine itself, but the other stuff is pretty significant as well. And as a rule of thumb, about $1.2 to $2.2 million per megawatt hour. So in other words, a 1 megawatt turbine would cost between $1.2 and $2.2 million to construct. Then you have to pay for ongoing. And so $10,000 a year for leasing is important. And remember that even though these things are huge, like all power sources, they're not operating at 100% capacity. For wind, it's about 33% capacity. Now, when you look at a fossil fuel power plant, they could operate very close to 100% capacity. Obviously, there's some thermal issues with that, but they typically don't. Whereas wind, 33% is about as good as it's ever going to get. Then I do want you to be familiar with where the various sources fall on this levelized cost of comparison. I'm not going to ask for exact numbers or anything like that, but you should generally be familiar with what's more or less expensive. And then we talk about wind power production agreements. And so you can see in here, in the latter years, people are signing up to buy wind power at a price of about 4 cents a kilowatt hour, 4 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So that tells you that's what people are willing to pay for it. No specific questions on the production tax credit. And then we talk about Germany's experience and how there are reasons to think it's working well, and there are plenty of reasons to conclude maybe it's not working well. And I told you that how you feel about Germany is likely is heavily influenced about how you feel about global warming and whether it's something we need to be making dramatic changes for. So that's the summary. Again, it's going to have, I've not finalized it yet. I've drafted it, but I've not finalized it. There's going to be around 26 to 28 multiple choice, around 3 to 4 very short answer questions, and then 4 vocabulary questions. Feel free to call me over the weekend if you have questions. You've got my cell phone. Thanks.